Good afternoon. Welcome to the OSD Historical Office Speaker Series. My name is Glenn Asner. I'm the Deputy Chief Historian for the Historical Office. We have video footage of this event today. It's being recorded, so and it will be made available to the public, so please remove your badges. Our speaker today is Dr. Sean McFate. He's a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and a professor of strategy at the National Defense University and Georgetown University School of Foreign Affairs. He also serves as an advisor to Oxford University Center for Technology and Global Affairs. He holds degrees from Brown University and Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, as well as a PhD in international relations from the London School of Economics. Dr. McFate began his career as a paratrooper and officer in the U.S. Army's 82nd Airborne Division. He later became a private military contractor and wrote about the privatization of warfare in his book, The Modern Mercenary. Remarkably, he has also served as a political risk consultant and has authored fiction books on the world of mercenaries. His latest book, The New Rules of War, has been widely hailed for its insights on the nature of warfare and recommendations for changes in strategic thinking needed for success in the future. We're delighted to have Dr. McFate here today. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Thank you very much. Thanks for taking time out of your lunch today on a Monday. I know it's post Game of Thrones, so it's pleased anybody shows up at all. As my host said, as I write now fiction and nonfiction, and everything that doesn't go into my nonfiction books goes into the fiction books, which is actually how I wrote this Tom Clancy-like series of international spy military thrillers. Not many people write fiction and nonfiction, so some of you out there are looking for your third, fourth, or fifth career. If you want to do both, the secret is this. If you want to do nonfiction, you wake up early in the morning and drink lots of coffee. If you want to do fiction, it's late at night with lots of scotch. So I wrote this book, The New Rules of War, and just so you know, because I'm speaking to an expert audience, a warrior audience, authors do not choose book titles. You know that, right? Editors choose book titles. I'm like, there's no rules of war. That makes no sense. He's like, no, trust, I wrote this book to be read. It's written in an accessible way, so you can listen to it on your commute, or my mother could read it, understand it, to try to move a national debate. And so it's written with titles like that to help get attention to move the national debate. Now, the reason I wrote this book is because I was angry. Like you, I suspect, I have lost good friends in Iraq and Afghanistan. That makes me angry. As a taxpayer, I am personally disgusted by seeing trillions of dollars, in my opinion, wasted in places like Iraq and Afghanistan and elsewhere, improving very little on the ground. And as a vet, it hurts me. It hurts me to see our national honor tarnished by low-level foes. But the problem is this, is that we have the very best military in the world. Even our adversaries know that. We have the best troops, the best training, the best equipment, the best technology, the most money. Our military has more money than the next 8 biggest militaries in the world combined. So what's the problem? And that is the central question of this book. Again, written not as an academic tome, but like a magazine, but with real ideas. This is what the book is about. And I'll tell you, since military audience, bottom line up front, here's the reason. Warfare has moved on, but we have not. Our adversaries grasp this and are lapping us strategically. Not tactically, not operationally. Nobody can match us tactically or operationally. Strategically, however, is a different story. We have to change our way of warfare. is what I argue in this book. The problem, though, is that we are a victorious nation. And historically, victorious nations do not change the way they fight wars. And why should they? Why should they? They're the best. So let's look at a case study for this. Let's go in the Wayback Machine 100 years ago as an example, and let's look at Billy Mitchell. Now, who here has heard of Billy Mitchell besides Air Force? All right, a lot of people. You're joint staffers, I can tell. Sometimes it's amazing. A lot of people have not heard Billy Mitchell, at least not outside of the Pentagon, perhaps. So Billy Mitchell was an Army aviator, American, in World War I, and he saw the future of war, and it was air power. It was air power. And when he came back to Washington 100 years ago, as a one-star, he told everybody who would listen to him, hey, the future of war is air power. We got to get ready now. We got to get ready now. And he was like initially blown off, and then he was kind of like, shut up. And his peers and others were saying, no, the future is not air power. Now, perhaps you've heard of a saying that generals always fight the last war, or the last successful war, with the exception of the generals in this room right now. This truism happens to be true. And what most people, when they predict the future of war, even today in this town, what they're really doing is looking in the rearview mirror and not out the windshield. And they think that the last successful war will be the future. It'll be, the future war will be, in this case, World War I with better technology. And so they thought the future of war would be what? It would be, you know, static line defense, trench line warfare, wars of attrition. And so what did they invest in? What was their super weapon? England, France, what did they invest in? So let me throw out some tanks, machine guns, okay? What else? Maginot Line. Operationally speaking, it's the Maginot Line. They built a super trench between themselves and Germany. That was the future of war to them. That was the future of war. And so when Mitchell came around and said, hey, the future war is air power, crickets. But then he said some crazy stuff, like, hey, an airplane can sink a battleship. Now think about it. In the early 1920s, an airplane was little more than a motorized kite in the era of the super dreadnought. Now he had some wasta. He got the Navy to pull out some old German battleships that were captured into the Chesapeake, and he sunk one. He sunk one. Now, you'd think this is all proof of concept, right? Wrong. What it did, well, it stirred up a huge debate within Washington and beyond Washington, nationally, about airplanes versus battleships. And a lot of people are saying, look, no, this is not the future of war. He was attacking an unarmed, like defenseless ship that was anchored in the middle of the Chesapeake, not fighting back. That's not war. This is best case scenario. It proves nothing. And he would say, no, it's proof of concept. That think about what will happen in the future. And this raged and raged in the Department of War until General Pershing, then the CGSC, if you will, perhaps to get Mitchell out of town to sort of save his career, to save him from himself, said, Billy, I'm getting you out of town just until this cools down. I'm going to send you on a one-year deployment, a Pacific cruise tour, a tour of inspection. Chill out in the Pacific for a year. So Mitchell disappeared for like 1922, 23, came back. He had a report this thick. In this like 400-plus page report, he said, in the future, Japan will launch a sneak attack at 7:30 a.m. Monday morning at Pearl Harbor using aircraft. Using aircraft. He said this in 1924. 1924. All right, now, so what do you think happened to Mitchell? Court-martialed him, yeah. So like when I talk to non-military audience, like, well, they embraced him. He was a hero. Like, no, no, he was court-martialed at Fort Leslie McNair across the river. And not just any court-martial, it was like a Kim Kardashian court-martial. It was a Sierra Foxtrot. It was like total messy. And it was really irregular, and he was, bottom line, he was defrocked. He said, I'm quit, I'm done. The last 5 years of his life, he went around the country talking to anybody who listened to him, saying the future of war is air power. The future of war is air power. People would occasionally show up just to hear the old fruitcake, but nobody took him seriously. It was a Maginot Line, and it was static line, you know, basically infantry, et cetera. Now, we all know how this story ends, right? And the military said it was caught completely by surprise. Not true. They had 15 years or so of early warning. Now, in the military, in its way, made up to Billy Mitchell, they apologized. They named a bomber after him, B-25, the only bomber, American bomber in World War II named after a person. The moral of the story is that victorious nations like ours are slow to change the way they fight. France and England, even during the Blitzkrieg of 1940, were in cognitive dissonance about what was going on. French historians noted at the time of the Blitzkrieg like that the strategic command, their minds were, quote, too inelastic, unquote, to comprehend France is falling. Remember, like France 4+ years, you know, World War I, now in like weeks, it falls. The question is, are we in a Billy Mitchell moment today? This is the question. Are we facing something similar today? Because even an undefeated military can lose. Rome thought itself the eternal city until 410 AD, when Alaric and barbarians sacked the place. Now, I'm not saying we're about to be sacked by barbarians. That's not today's message, right? But what I am saying is that we are vulnerable, whether we know it or not. So if I ask you today, like, what are our biggest threats? Who could actually pose a threat to us? We could spend all afternoon on this discussion, which we're not going to do, right? We're not going to do that. But we all know some of the bigger threats: China, Russia, Iran, ISIS 2.0 or 3.0, depending how you count it. Narcos, Venezuela, the list goes on and on. Genocide, North Korea. We could continue this all day. We're not going to. Now, as bad as these threats are, they are not the worst. There is something systemic that has helped driving them, that they're either exploiting or they're opportunists of, or something else that's more fundamental, that's more causal than any of those combined. It's something that I call durable disorder. Now, durable disorder, what is that? Durable disorder is, think of sort of I hate this term world order, but think of world order in the post-Westphalian era. We all know in the last 30 years, social science is pretty clear on this, that nation states everywhere around the world are in retreat. Obviously not West Europe, North America, East Asia, and other parts. But if you think about the 190, 95 countries in the world, the vast majority are fragile or failed, or failing. A trend that has been going on for 25, 30 years, right? When people think about states, we always think about the top 30, not the bottom 175. So think about that. So this is what happens in the wake of that. This is what's left behind. Now, it is not anarchy and the Knights of Ni, all right? This is not like the sky is falling, we need to invest in more sky. What this is, it's not pure anarchy, but it's persistent conflict and persistent disorder, hence durable disorder. When you don't have sort of they say a state is that entity which has a monopoly of force within its territory. Well, most states in the world, at least half of them, that's challenged. That's challenged. It can contain problems, actually, but not solve them, all right? It is systemic. It's a systemic threat. So rather than looking at agents and actors, we should think systemically and structurally about the international security environment that we're facing. And most importantly, it's not new. For those in the back who can't see this is not new. Durable disorder, the history of humanity mostly looks like this. The world that we learned about in 6th grade of international relations is all controlled by states, only states can wage wars, only those, that's nonsense. That's ahistorical. Most history, it's not about states. Before there were states, states were only a few centuries old. Empire was mostly what human history is about, or tribal, or something in between, right? You don't have strong states, you have strong all sorts of actors on the world stage. And this is the world that, say, Machiavelli was talking about in The Prince. Anybody who was rich enough to afford mercenaries could wage war for any reason they wanted, no matter how petty. And that's what most of the Middle Ages, or you're going back to the Roman Empire, or any place in Africa or South Asia, this is kind of what it looks like, durable disorder. And as nation states retreat, this is what we're left behind. We're actually returning to normal, the status quo ante. Okay? So here's signs today of durable disorder. Half of all peace deals fail in 5 years. I personally am not optimistic about Afghanistan has a bad slip up. But I think it'll have more in common with Vietnam than Japan and the USS Missouri, if we actually have a peace deal there. Most countries are fragile or failed. There are some form of organized violence in most countries today. We're seeing the return of mercenaries. And these are not the caricatures of Hollywood or the lone guy in the Congo jungle with an AK-47 in the 50s and 60s. This is the Wagner Group. These are other mercenaries floating around Yemen. And we're seeing mercenaries everywhere. You know, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, Ukraine, Venezuela, I'm told, Libya, Congo, Somalia, and points in between. And we're also seeing the rise of things that rival nation states. So the Fortune 500, for example, are more powerful than most nation states. So when Exxon Mobil shows up in the Gulf of Guinea, you've got to be kidding me if you think that the Gabon is more powerful than Exxon Mobil simply because it's a state. Exxon, the extractive industry, they get involved. They're political actors. They get involved. And they have to go where their resource is. And they have long-term costs, and they have to. And now that, you know, it might be a point where oil companies or oligarchs or whomever can get their own Mi-24 Hind attack squad or special operations. They can be armed and dangerous, which is exactly kind of what Nigeria did, by the way, in 2015. 6 years, the Nigerian military, not a weak military, could not deal with Boko Haram. In 2015, they secretly hired mercenaries to help them with the problem. And these guys showed up with Mi-24 attack helicopters and SOF, mercenary SOF, and they cleared up Boko Haram in weeks. Did not solve it, they contained it. They did the old strategy of push it into your neighbor's backyard, right? But the Nigerian military couldn't do that. Think about that. So what we're seeing now are forever wars. And when I teach at Georgetown, I have graduate students who are like 25, 30, who are precocious. Well, two things. First of all, they think that the Cold War is like the Peloponnesian War. It's like way back there. Kind of depressing to some of us in the room. The second is that they think forever wars is normal. That's the new normal, and that's sad. It doesn't have to be that way, okay? So the durable disorder is the new global environment. It's not going to take over the Westphalian world order, but it's competing with, it's surpassing perhaps. Those who understand this can exploit it, and those who do not will be exploited. Unfortunately, in my opinion, US foreign policy looks like this. It's the Humpty Dumpty approach. We're trying to reinvent the liberal world order as we conceive it in a world that has moved on. Right? And also there are many people in this town and certain think tanks who are like, well, we just need to reestablish the liberal world order, but it may be more of a fiction in their mind than a reality. You know, it may not be desirable or feasible, is my point. So this is a new type of world order, a new type of global environment, and it begets a new type of warfare. And this is why we struggle. We're still sort of tooled to fight a certain way of warfare that no longer exists or is rapidly in the rearview mirror. And this is something the NDS captures, that disorder is the threat. The other actors can rise out of it, can exploit it, But the underlying threat is disorder and, of course, great power competition, who also exploit it. And obviously, you know, most people, when they hear that, they assume it's these two guys, right? All right. But here's the problem, is that when you talk to most people, and I don't think the authors at the NDS believe this, but most people, when they hear great power competition, they assume conventional warfare. Conventional warfare. Bad assumption. Why does everybody think that way? There's no such thing as conventional war anymore. That's the old way of warfare. That's the Westphalian way of warfare. In the future, there might be armed conflicts that have a conventional sort of phase or conventional characteristics, but the predominant characteristic of modern and future warfare is not going to look like World War II with better technology. We're building Maginot Lines, and others are doing other things, right? There's nothing more unconventional than a conventional war today, right? And that's sort of these 10 new rules of war, call them rules, ideas, principles, I don't care. This is one of them. This is the very first one. It'll cause some people to shake their heads. That's okay. We can discuss that in Q&A. But the social science bears this out. So here are armed conflicts since World War II. Red on the bottom is sort of interstate traditional warfare, conventional warfare, loosely imagined. Blue is everything else. And it doesn't count everything. That doesn't count like the Rwanda genocide or narco wars. Blue is everything else. Again, there is nothing more unconventional in the last 70 years of war than a conventional war. Nobody fights conventionally anymore except for us, right? Okay, now we can even have this discussion over Q&A. Are we already at war with China and Russia? And part of their strategy is to keep us thinking that we're at peace, knowing that we act differently when if we think we're at peace than war. Are we already at war with them? So what does war actually look like in this new global environment of durable disorder? It's getting sneakier. War is getting sneakier. It's not getting stronger in terms of firepower, it's getting sneakier with a cunning win over the strong. So a couple examples here. The Crimea. Old rules of war, when I say rules of war, again, I'm talking to a mass audience, not to an expert audience. And I'm talking really about conventional warfare, all right? Old rules of war, when Russia wanted to take something, like the Soviet Union, what would it do? Mass forces, tank treads, right. So think of Hungary 56, Czechoslovakia 68. Now they could have done that in eastern Ukraine and Crimea. They had relative military power to do so. They could have blitzkrieged in, but they didn't. They chose covert means. Think about it. They chose covert means. They chose Spetsnaz, special forces, mercenaries like the Wagner Group, proxy militia like Donbass Battalion, little green men, lots of propaganda and active measures. What else did they do? Am I missing anything? You get the point, right? You get the point. So war is getting epistemological. Those who can discern truth from lies determines winners and losers. In the old rules of war, it was battlefield victory. It was Waterloo, Gettysburg, Midway, battlefield victory. Now it's this. And the reason this works is because, well, basically what's happening is that the IC knew what was going on, but policymakers, they're still scratching their heads, saying, well, what's Russia really doing in the Crimea? And when that was still going on, because Russia is manufacturing the fog of war for victory, it's become a global disinformation power. While that was going on, while Americans and others were scratching their head trying to figure out exactly what was going on for the policy response, it was a fait accompli. It was a fait accompli, right? The strategic logic of this is this. We live in a global information age, right? We all agree on that. In a global information age, plausible deniability is more powerful than firepower. So means that give you plausible deniability, like special forces or SOF or mercenaries or proxies or whatever, that gives you more strategic latitude than committing, Hungary 1956, right? Than committing tank battalions with flags and old rules of war. So that's an example. Another example, South China Sea. China, we throw carrier groups in there. We do all sorts of things. It's not deterring China. They're winning China one island and one ally at a time, and they don't have aircraft carriers, or none worth talking about. So how are they doing it? Well, they're doing it strategically. We're playing at the tactical and operational level. They're thinking at the strategic level. We have this we have this idea that war is like pregnancy. You either are or you are not, right? You are. That's a false dichotomy. That's a construction in our head. Or another way to think about it is that war is like a light switch. It's either on or off. There's no dimmer in this situation. It's on or off. And what they do is that China gets right in between where our notion of peace and war lie, and they exploit it for victory. So what they do is they go right to the brink of war where we would stop and do something, and they stop. But they keep everything they capture or kill or create. They keep it all. And this gradual incrementalism is how they're strategically winning, by keeping our light switch switched to off. Keeping our light switch switched off. That's a strategic move. And you should read the three warfare strategy. It's China's plan, it's their national security strategy to get us out of their region. It's their Monroe Doctrine. And the three warfares are not military. They're economic, information, and lawfare. Economic, information, lawfare, not military. And it's succeeding to some extent. And we should take a look at that. I'm not saying we should replicate it, but we should take a look at that. Or this. These are mercenaries. These are supposedly ex-Green Berets and ex-SEALs in Yemen as a hit squad for a Mideast monarchy. We're seeing the rise of mercenaries everywhere. If you think it's just Eric Prince and Blackwater and Nisour Square, no, it's gone way worse than that. Way worse than that. I mean, Yemen, we can talk about this but in Q&A, but basically warfare, when you privatize war, it changes warfare. Because suddenly, military strategies now blend with market ones. Military strategies blend with market ones. So for example, let's go back in time. This is the OSD History Forum. Let's go back to Florence during Machiavelli's time, where warfare was highly privatized, because nobody could afford to own their own army. It's too expensive. They rented them. Mercenaries were common. If you're Florence and you want to take over, say, the city of Siena, which is a much smaller town, what you would do before you even announce your campaign is you'd buy all the mercenary units in your region to deny Siena a defense. You'd buy up the entire market so that once Siena realized that you were about to attack them and they went to the market for force, there were nobody left. You bought them all. You retained them all. That's a market strategy for war. But Siena could bribe half of them. They could outbid them in secret. And Siena actually did this in 1506, which is why I think Machiavelli is so bitter against mercenaries. He got burned. He was like the ASD for Florence. Got really badly burned, and then now we're stuck with his mercenaries suck. The truth is that mercenaries, they're like fire. They can burn down your house, they can power a steam engine, but they're not inherently morally good or morally evil. I mean, think about it. Would you rather be a POW for Blackwater or a POW for Venezuela? Just because, or Zimbabwe. Just because it's a national army doesn't make them saints and mercenary sinners. Think of mercenaries in some ways as so this might be controversial, but like soldiers are wives and mercenaries are prostitutes, right? They take love and make it transactional. It's kind of icky for a lot of people. But so it's interesting. So we're seeing the return of private military force in the world today, but always in the shadows. So in the future, victory goes to the cunning and not the strong. But the problem is that we are heavily invested in the strong. And we're heavily invested in conventional war. Look at our palm. It's all conventional war weapons, right? It's all conventional war weapons. So this is the new, durable disorder is the new global environment for war. We are not set up to fight war efficiently in this global environment. Our systems, our bureaucracy, our habits, what we buy, how we fight, train, all those things are set up to defeat an adversary in old rules of war, and then we get frustrated by the result. We get frustrated by the result. I call this strategic atrophy. Tactically, operationally, we are the best. We're the best of the best. That's not hyperbole. We all know that. Our enemies know that. But the strategic level of war, it's not. We're like a fiddler crab with that one claws like gigantic and the other claws like minuscule. When it comes to strategic thinking, we have strategic atrophy. That's the problem. So here's an example. Here's war as we imagine it, right? An example. This is a mechanical horse, a robotic ass, whatever you want to call it. This is a prototype. We spent like $45 million on it, so like nothing by DoD standards, but still, $45 million for 10 years for this prototype, 10 years, and I think it's designed to carry like soft luggage around the battlefield. That's my guess. Here's the problem with it, though, is that good luck getting parts if it breaks down in Iran. It can't go everywhere a soldier or troop can go. And most importantly, it sounds like a lawnmower, right? The truth is, a real mule would be cheaper and better. But we're investing in this because we fetishize technology. It's one of our ways of war. There's a technical solution for warfare. Well, wars are armed politics. Technical solutions may or may not apply. For the last 70 years, Luddites have routinely beaten the world's most advanced technological militaries. Think of like France and Indochina and Algeria, Great Britain and Palestine, Cyprus, the Soviets in Afghanistan, us in Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq. Luddites are winning. If there's anything to look at in the last 70 years of war, it's this. Technology is not decisive in modern war. And then think of that third offset strategy, which is all about technology, or RMA, if you want. All right. So we have, the T-1000, or whatever this is, the T-500. We're prototypes. They're working on the prototype to do this. Also, for those who play Call of Duty, here's a DARPA project. It's like a goggles that someday soldiers would wear in combat that gives you like almost perfect symmetry, knowledge of the battlefield, IFF, collective targeting, vitals, all those things. Really cool. The problem is that we already dominate the tactical and operational level of war, so why are we investing there when strategically we need it? And this is going to be controversial, the F-35, okay? Very controversial. $1.5 trillion for this program. That's more money than Russia's GDP. If this airplane was ranked as a country in the world, its GDP would be 11th in the world, ahead of Saudi Arabia, India, other places. Now, in 2 long wars, how many combat missions? Okay, somebody's going to say 1 or 2 or 3, because remember last fall we started using them? So I would argue, being an old dumb grunt, that those don't count because the enemy wasn't shooting back. But the point is this, $45,000 a flight hour. That's almost as much money as the salary of the guy repairing the thing. The measure of any weapon system is its utility, right? So we're investing in Ford-class carriers, $13 billion a copy, before you add aircraft and sailors, F-35. These are outstanding weapons, but they may be already antiquated. The battleship was obsolete in 1939, but we didn't know it until 1943, right, during the Battle of Midway. The battleship, if you want to become an admiral, you had to serve on a battleship. After World War II, they were replaced by carriers as kings of the sea. Is this the modern battleship? I don't know. It's a question. I'll leave it open for you. All right, that's how we imagine war. Let's look about war in reality today. How do you win modern wars? Strategically, you win strategically, right? There's this. If you're a democracy, you're vulnerable to election tampering. It's not just in this country. It's also the Brexit. It's in elections recently across Europe. The strategic logic is this. Who cares about the sword when you can manipulate the arm that wields it? That's the strategic logic. It's not a kinetic strategy. It's a political one that has implications. Or this. So in the old rules of war, well, Russia and the Soviets, for example, have always wanted to disunite Europe, right? That's their goal. Disunite NATO, disunite the EU. In the old rules of war, what would they do in the Cold War? How would they try to do that, for example? They would have these huge military exercises on the border of East and West Germany. So think of it as a Pod 81, 150,000 soldiers lined up to do an invasion across the Fulda Gap. And they just tell NATO, hey, don't worry, we Soviets are just doing an exercise, just chill out. And of course, NATO is like, I don't know about that. It could be a ruse. Now what they do, they want to break up Europe. What they do is they take conventional weapons like bombers, but they use them in unconventional ways. In this case, they bombed Syrian civilian centers to help create a refugee crisis, a tidal wave of refugees that would crash on the shores of the EU that resulted in the Brexit, that result in the rise of right-wing national parties who want to break up the EU. They weaponized refugees. That's a Sun Tzuian approach rather than a Clausewitzian approach, and that's the new rules of war. Or this, when was the last time anybody here saw a movie with China as a villain? When was the last time? Do not say Red Dawn 2. Terrible movie. Yeah, right? Nobody knows. You know why? Because they bought Hollywood legally, and now they green light. So in an era where strategic influence matters more than bullets, where some of the best weapons do not fire bullets, they bought one of the biggest megaphones in the world, and it was our megaphone. And they're building their own in China to rival ours someday, they hope. That's war in reality. So what does victory look like? Well, it's not going to be this. This is how conventional wars end. Treaties, right? Peace treaties. There's war and peace in conventional war. In modern war, it's war and peace, not war or peace. So what does it look like? Well, it's an infinite game. Think of like business. You have up cycles, you have down cycles. You're not looking for a wipeout, like Coke is not going to wipe out Pepsi. You know, that rarely happens in the business world. But guess what? We've been here before. Think of the Cold War. Was the Cold War, was that really a metaphor? Was it a war? If you talk to people in that era, they will say, oh, it's a war. It was a war, okay? That's what we're going to see again, more of. Now, the good news is that we can win in this new environment. There's not a problem. We can win. And it's actually quite easy. All we've got to do is change the way we think. Of all the things we had to change, that's probably the easiest, because we have control over it. And for this reason, I propose in this book these 10 new ideas about how to win at the strategic level of warfare. Now, rules 1 through 4 are things we have to stop doing, and rules 5 through 10 are the things we have to start doing. It is controversial, but I'm trying to help create an intellectual insurgency to shift a paradigm, to catch up with our adversaries who've already moved forward. And so with that, I'd like to turn over to questions, and thank you very much. Thank you. Any questions? Yes, sir.
I'm going to jump on number 4 right quick.
Thank you.
Hearts and minds do not matter. Please explain.
Yeah, so I'm glad that you raised question number 4 is hearts and minds do not matter. So this is in the category of things to stop doing. So remember I talked to you about, I said in Hollywood, China has strategic influence. That is the future in some ways, a strategic influence, something that we are not very good at. We know, and there's some reasons for that. We're a democracy, we have structures upon us, and we just got to get better at it. Hearts and minds do not matter. What this really refers to is how we prosecuted counterinsurgency in Iraq and Afghanistan, and why that was a strategic failure, in my opinion. And the reason is this, is because the strategic logic of COIN, as we practice it at the tactical and operational level, was we're going to bribe the population. But that's not how populations work. So imagine China goes to Detroit and says, hey, we'll give you free health care, free food, and a football stadium. And all you got to do is vote communist your next election. What would the people of Detroit do? They'll say, we'll take all your stuff, but we're not going to take your ideas. That's what happened in Iraq and Afghanistan, and we're wondering why. The reason it happened is because the people who came up with counterinsurgency They basically, they were like bad students who they copied somebody else's homework and didn't understand the question. So FM 3-24 is based on the work of this guy called David Galula. Anybody heard of David Galula? David Galula, yeah, he was a French-Tunisian officer who lived he was active from like World War II to 1960. And he went around the world and he saw insurgencies, Maoist-like insurgencies, and he was trying to figure out a way to defeat them. And he came up with an idea. But his objective was this. His objective was not a democracy with its own military. His objective was to reestablish French colonial rule amongst unruly natives. So to put the heel of French colonialism back into like Vietnam or the Congo, et cetera. It's the wrong model for us building democracies. You know, and also lastly, if you really want to do a counterinsurgency, this rule explains how to do it. It is brutal. It is bloody. It is unethical. What you do is, there's three things you do. One is it requires a lot of violence, a lot of collateral damage, okay? Second is it requires you importing your population into that area so that the people become a minority in their own homeland. And the third is you export parts of their population elsewhere. That's how it's done, okay? Think of China and Tibet, Morocco, Western Sahara, arguably Israel. Think about, since we're at the History Forum, think about the first Judeo-Roman War in 66 AD. Think about how we settled the West in the 19th century with the US Army. That's what it was. That's how COIN is done. And if it's not acceptable to us, then we should not engage. So that's what rule number 4 is about. Other questions? Yes, sir. I'm back here. Yeah.
So where do you see China's Silk Road initiative? Making investments in sub-Saharan Africa and other places where they have resources?
Yeah, it's a great, good question. I was actually just debating Eric Prince 2 weeks ago in Vienna. And Eric and I go way back. We're frenemies. He works for Beijing. So he's pitching this plan now that his 6,000 mercenaries, along with some soft guys and CIA, can fix Afghanistan. 6,000 in a year, progress, which, of course, they're his mercenaries. It's a big payday for him. He's also currently working for Frontier Services Group, which is a Chinese-owned company. He's working for China because Chinese companies like Huawei, they work for Beijing. They're not like our multinationals. So when Huawei, when Beijing says, we want you to collect on become a collecting asset for us, Huawei says, of course, we're doing 5G throughout Europe, of course. Meanwhile, like Apple Computer will not unlock an iPhone in a CT case in LA, right? Totally different view of how you use corporations. So One Belt, One Road is one of their 3 warfares, is economic warfare. So One Belt, One Road, in some ways, is liberalization of markets. That's all good, but it's also a national security strategy. And just ask Sri Lanka, who got Tony Soprano'd out of their biggest port, right? They're doing predatory lending. They're conquering through economics, One Belt, One Road. So I am a buyer beware, a caveat emptor when it comes to that. Question back here, gentleman back here. Yes, sir.
Could you speak to how this plays out in a democratic United States?
Great questions. Yeah.
That has come up 3 times in your response.
Yeah. So it's a good question. Is how does this play out in a democracy? And it plays out in a messy way. Okay. So I do for a living. I observe war, as you do, but from a different perch, right? A different place. And I'm observing war getting more sneaky. I'm not advocating that I want war to be like ninjas. I'm saying this is the way warfare is going, but here's the problem, is that we are a democracy. And we learned in the 1970s, during the age of intelligence reform, during like the Church Committee and others, that secrets and democracy are not compatible. So how do we fight? If war is going sneakier and we got to get sneaky as well, to wage what I call like shadow war, Rule 9. That's sort of like, think of IW writ large right now. How do we do that? How do we do that? And I don't have a good answer for you. What I do, there's a couple things in this book that I bracket. I say, here's a really important topic that I'm flagging in intellectual honesty that we need to think more about, but it's beyond the scope of the book. One is this question, how do democracies fight sneaky and or dirty, depending on how you think of dirty? And second is, like things like war ethics. I just bracket that. It's the next conversation we have to have. The other thing I bracket is we need a grand strategy, but what that would look like in a durable disorder. Next question, please. Yes, sir.
So you're looking into the future.
Yeah.
And you're looking into the future with China and other countries. With the South China Sea and with China's seeming intent eventually to take back Taiwan, is there a role for big technology there?
Yeah, so big technology. So in rule number 2, I talk about how technology will not save us. And what I mean by that is that it's sort of traditional warfare technology. Like people want it, like third offset strategy stuff. Like people think that hypersonic missiles and robot swarms and all that stuff is going to be the war of the future. That's all tactical thinking. And you don't win wars tactically. You can if you're in attrition warfare, like World War I. But most of it, you're looking to be, checkmate the enemy rather than taking out every piece they have. And so I do think that we need technology, but it's not what people think. First of all, AI is not as advanced as it's portrayed by Hollywood. Okay, like my 3-year-old son is smarter than most AI, right? Second, people talk about cyber war all the time, but they don't know what it means. You get, I have to go on a rant for 2 seconds on cyber, okay? First of all, it's become like the cha-ching for DoD. Like if you have a pet project and you put cyber dash your pet project and put out your hands, money falls into your hands now, all right? Sort of like what coin was 10 years ago. You get 10 experts in the room about what is cyber, ask the question, what is cyber? You'll get 11 answers, beyond ones and zeros in space. And then people always say, well, cyber is a big deal because, a hacker could take down the whole eastern seaboard. Well, people have been saying that for 20-some years, starting with Dick Clark in the National Security Council in the late 1990s. The truth is, this is the truth, is that squirrels are a bigger threat to our national security grid than cyber, right? We know that more squirrels take down the electrical grids than cyber. So, but we don't make a new category of warfare. We don't call it like rodent warfare. I mean, that's, we don't think about it. So we have like the jazz hands around cyber. So there is a role for cyber, and I think, leaving the tactical out of it, like the whole Taiwanese Straits, the strict, cunning, like Sun Tzuian cunning, and something called the 36 Stratagems of War, which is in the book that I recommend you look at. It's like the Chinese strategic mind does not think the way the Western strategic mind does. That will win. And I think that things like messaging, so how does technology work in this case? So think of like the problem of clickbait. We all know the problem of clickbait, right? We all have clothes that say where our clothes were made. Why can't we find a technical solution so that this clickbait was made in North Korea? People will be a lot less likely to click on it knowing that's the case. So how do we use technology to make people in democracies savvier consumers of information? Beyond just like we need to have a generational better education. That's not really an actionable policy. So that, I think there, it matters a great deal, as well as creating what I call plausible indeniability. Like if China or Russia is doing something around the world, how do we find ways to expose it? And then how do we fight back using potentially dark arts? So there is a role for technology, but it's not like the hypersonic missile that I think everybody's sort of thinking about. Which doesn't mean it's not a threat. I just think that we have to get our head out of the parapet of tactical thinking. Yes, sir, in the back.
I think broadly what you're talking about is political warfare, and the DoD is the war-fighting arm of the U.S. government, but we're generally apolitical personnel.
Right.
We're not well-versed, nor are we well-trained in politics, particularly politics of foreign governments. So, how does the DoD adapt to an environment where political warfare dominates over kinetic?
It's a good question. So we have, and we're very proud of, a democracy, a civil-military divide, which we all know about, right? And a distrust of tyranny and a distrust of armed soldiers that goes back to our founding. If you read our Constitution, there's no standing army. There's a Navy, right? But there's no like standing army. Congress has the ability to raise a military. And as a result, our military has been trained to not be political in this way. even though that war is fundamentally political. It's armed politics. So in many ways, I'm arguing that we need to have more politically minded generals. I don't mean Republican versus Democrat. I mean in terms of international affairs. We need more like George C. Marshalls. They are hard to find. I mean, I don't know how we produce George C. Marshalls. But we need more strategic thinking, or Eisenhowers, who can think about war as beyond just battle, beyond tactical and operational. And one of the things I suggest in this book, I talk about the need for creating strategists, what I call war artists, because they have to, strategy is like jazz. It's not like, classical, you have to improvise in strategy. And there's no school book solution for any of this. So we need to create strategists who can think about ambiguity. And one of these reasons I say that we should study like liberal arts, for strategists early. And right now, when does a strategic education begin for a military officer? What year, more or less? 12, maybe like 15 or 20, right? Maybe 12 if you're lucky. But why do we wait so long? Let's do it when people are 18. And let's do things that are not, like if you go to West Point or Annapolis, what's your curriculum? It's engineering, right? You're doing hard science, which is about complicated problems versus complex ones. Strategy is about complex ones. So I would to your point, would say that we need to think about warfare in a new way. That's what this book's trying to do. And it's not just for DoD consumption, it's for the national security establishment. Yes, sir, then over here, this man.
Two parts. One, to understand how we got to durable disorder.
Yeah.
I haven't read the book yet, but I'm curious if you get into the history of that. During the age of all the empires following in the 20th century, in this rush to develop all these new nation states, we built them with fragile foundations, didn't understand institution building, and that's why we're at this. And then for the future, would you then recommend going back in time and studying, say, warfare during the French and Indian War, which was this global and regular warfare, and the British East India Company?
So I do talk about all of those things, though. I talk about the British East India Company. I talk about, to some extent, the 7 Years' War. Where this happened, and I go into some depth on this, is durable disorder is always kind of how the world operated. Nation states didn't have a privileged perch. That sort of happened sometime between 1648 and 1850. All right. In that time, somehow, nobody knows. I spent last year as a fellow at Oxford trying to get to this. They have no clue. Nobody knows. But nation states, somehow, they did two things. They became the only actor in international relations, and they also invested in standing national armies. And they had an ideology starting in 1800 of nationalism. So right now, we all have like flags and national anthem. That wasn't the case 400 years ago. People didn't have nations like that. We forget that. So they somehow seized the monopoly of force so that by 1850s, the mercenary trade was completely underground. And now, post-Cold War, it's slowly coming back to normal. Normal being historically normal. And that's I don't think we can put that toothpaste back in the tube. And that's why we got to think about international relations under durable disorder, which is the status quo ante, rather than this imagined, whatever, our fantasy. We're running out of time, so if I could take this other person's comment, is it, ma'am?
I would argue that everyone in this room has lived and fought in a unilateral world. Is durable disorder inherently multilateral? And if so, how does that change how we read your rules?
It is inherently multilateral. Durable disorder is inherently multilateral, but no longer should you think just about states. So we are taught, and it's not just sixth grade, it's like political science is state-centric, okay? If you can imagine the world without states, it's hard for a lot of people. It's like listening to your own accent, right? It's hard. But I would encourage you to do that. The Middle East conflicts might look a little bit different if you remove the state boundaries and thought about what political entities are fighting on the ground. Same with Africa, same with Latin America. I mean, the last 2 years ago, in some ways you can look at like Latin America as just wars between cartels. That it's rule number 8. There will be wars without states. Cartels are fighting, and rather than states driving conflict, which is what we're taught to, states rule the roost, states are booty to be won in war. We call them narco states. Think of Salvador, Guatemala, arguably Mexico, right? So in the future, rules 6, 7, 8 are a triad. When you see mercenaries start to come up, that means that the super rich can become a superpower, which leads to rule number 7. That suddenly, it's not just terrorists, rich terrorists, and oligarchs, but the wealthiest people in the world can be armed and dangerous. So can, Fortune 500. They can all have armies now, private armies. And then they can fight each other, and that yields rule number 8. And rule number 9 is this stuff is going to go, it's going to be sub rosa. Occasionally it'll bubble up for visibility, but much of this is going to be, with plausible deniability, things are going on under the hood. And we have to think in terms of that, and that international relations is no longer about states, it's about other things too, in addition to. So that would be, so yes, it's inherently multipolar, but in ways that we don't do. I mean, our State Department doesn't have alliances with non-state actors. There's no if you're going to go to Africa, you should maybe think about the extractive industry. Can you create an alliance with a multinational? Thinking about that. So there should be maybe new rules of diplomacy too. All right, we're getting to 1 o'clock. So do we have one last alibi round from somebody? Yes, sir.
The struggles around the Second Amendment in our nation.
Yes.
Does that have something to do with this? I mean, are oligarchs like George Soros, Bloomberg, trying to disarm the American people so that this doesn't take, we can't fight for our own?
I don't know the answer to that regarding the Second Amendment. I will say this, is that right now, I think we'd all agree that we're having a cultural, war is a strong word, cultural conflict within our nation about who we are, et cetera. We are a democracy. Democracies are messy. That's fine if we're fighting each other, if you will, like a family at a Thanksgiving. But if there are external powers fanning those flames, that's not okay. And that's what I fear, is that we have external powers, some will be states, some will be other things, fanning the flames of discord and chaos in our country that they hope to exploit in some way. So that is indeed my fear.
Not the second, but the first.
The first what?
The First Amendment.
Oh, the First Amendment,
Yeah,
okay.
attack all day long from anywhere in the world.
Yeah, First Amendment.
Well, we have a lot of problems with strategic messaging too, because we can't, the Smith-Monk Act, for example, was written in the 1950s before internet or email, and you can't propagandize Americans abroad. That was fine in the 1950s. We need to update it to the 21st century. And strategic influence, we have to get better at that, and how to do that is a bigger question. I'll end with this. There's a case study in here. I have a couple of ideas here, some of which are whatever, crazy, but worth investigating. Something called American Foreign Legion and some other things like that. And it's not Jean-Claude Van Damme and Spanx. Okay, so one of the ideas is since we're at the History Forum, think of Guatemala 53. Okay, Guatemala 53 was a very new rules of war. We had regime change there without any sort of military. We psyched out the adversary. Now, the circumstances around Guatemala 53 are very controversial, and what happened are very controversial. I am no ways rationalizing or defending it. In the book, I talk about what did we do there that could be of interest to us now. That some of the best weapons here at Rule 5 do not fire bullets. This is an example of that. We've done this before. We've just forgotten. And this book is trying to make us relearn. So with that, thank you very much. It's been a great privilege to have an hour of your time today, and I'll stick around if anybody has any further questions. Thank you very much.